Hi, my sweet friends, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. We are continuing, almost nearing the end of Swiss Family Robinson. Today we're starting with chapter 57, Cotton Nuts, Terrific Encounter with Lion and Lioness, a Savage, Parley, and Recognition of a Friend. Our first care on rising the next morning was to set about the preparation of the boar. Jack had recovered from his fear, and accompanied by the dogs, we set out to look for the dead boar. He was enormous, between a boar and a buffalo in size, and his head was indeed frightfully large. "I fear," said I, "that the flesh of this old African is not better than a European boar. My advice is that instead of dragging the immense carcass away, we cut off what we want and let the rest alone." My sons agreed with me, and we began to cut off the hams and head of the wild boar. Some branches of trees furnished us with sleds to put the pieces on, and we made the dogs draw them to the shore. While we were occupied in disposing of our hams, chance made known to us an important discovery. Ernest remarked on the branches we had cut to make our sleds a sort of nut. He opened one, but instead of a kernel, it contained a beautiful fine cotton of a deep yellow, which I recognized as being the real Nankin cotton. This cotton owes its name to a province of China where it grows abundantly and is cultivated with much care. We made a large provision of these nuts and dug up 2 young trees to carry to Felsenheim. Jack shrank with fright from the head of his terrible enemy and appeared quite overjoyed that it was going to figure in our museum, but on the observation of Ernest that it would be very difficult to prepare, and having heard that boar's head was very fine eating, we resolved to cook it with truffles in the Otaheitan manner. Consequently, Fritz and Ernest set to work and dug a deep ditch while I cleaned the head and heated some stones. When these preparations were finished, we placed the head, stuffed with truffles and seasoned with salt, pepper, and nutmeg, in a ditch and covered it with red-hot stones and a thick layer of earth. While our supper was cooking, we suspended the hams over the smoke of the fire and tranquilly sat down to talk over the events of the day, when suddenly a deep, prolonged cry rang through the forest. It was the first time we had ever heard such unearthly tones. The rocks echoed it, and we felt seized with sudden terror. The dogs and the jackal also commenced howling horribly. "What a diabolical concert," said Fritz, jumping up and seizing his gun. "Some danger must be near. Build up the fire," continued he, "and while I try to discover the danger in my Jack, you retire to the canoe." This plan appeared the best we could pursue, and I adopted it. We threw on the fire all the wood we could find ready cut, and without losing time we regained the canoe. Fritz jumped into the Jack and was soon lost in the obscurity. During all this time the roarings continued, and they appeared to approach nearer to us. Our dogs gathered round the fire, uttering plaintive moans. Our poor little monkey seemed to suffer painfully from fear. I imagined that it was a leopard or a panther which had been attracted by the remains of the wild boar in the wood. My doubts did not last long, for we soon discovered by the pale light of our fires a terrible lion, considerably larger and stronger than those I had seen in the royal menageries of Europe. In 2 or 3 leaps he bounded over the space which separated the wood from the shore. He stood immovable for a moment, and then commenced lashing his flanks with his tail and roaring furiously, every moment crouching down as if to spring on us. This frightful pantomime did not last long. Every moment he would run to the stream, lap up some water, and then return. I remarked with mortal anguish that the animal came nearer and nearer to the shore, and at length he lay crouched down, his flaming eyes fixed directly on us. Half in fear, half in despair, I raised my gun and was about to fire when suddenly I heard a report. The animal bounded up, gave a tremendous yell, and fell lifeless on the earth. "'Tis Fritz," murmured my poor Ernest, pale with terror. "Oh, God, protect my brother." "Yes, it is he," I cried, "our brave Fritz. He has saved us from a terrible death. Let's go to him." In 2 strokes of the oars we were on shore, but our dogs, with an admirable instinct, began to bark terribly. I did not neglect this indication. We threw more wood on the fire and again jumped into the boat. It was time, for scarcely were we secure when a second enemy rushed from the forest. It was not so large as the first, but its roar was frightful. This time it was a lioness, probably the companion of the superb animal which we had just killed. How grateful I felt that both had not appeared together. What could we have done? The lioness ran straight up to the corpse of her late partner, smelled it, and licked up the blood which had flowed from the wound. And when she was convinced that he no longer lived, she set up a howl of rage that pen could not describe. She lashed her sides and opened her enormous mouth as if she would devour us all. Again Fritz fired, and the shot, less fortunate than the first, only broke the shoulder of the animal. The wounded lioness commenced rolling on the sand, foaming with rage, but all three of our dogs rushed upon her. Brawn and Fulb seized the animal in the flanks, and Flora caught hold of the throat. Another shot would have put an end to the combat, but I was afraid of wounding the dogs, so I jumped from the boat, and running up to the animal who was held fast by the dogs, I plunged my hunting knife direct to her heart. The blood spouted out, and the lioness fell, but the victory had cost us dear, for there lay our poor Flora, dead under the terrible wounds she had received from the fangs of the monster. Fritz now ran up and threw himself into my arms, as did Ernest and poor Jack, who trembled with mortal agony. We lighted our torches and directed our course toward the field of battle. We found poor Flora, with her teeth yet clutching the throat of her enemy, while the royal couple lay majestically extended on the sand, and we could hardly suppress a sentiment of fear which struck us as we gazed on the terrific beasts. "What a terrible range of teeth," said Ernest as he raised up the head of the lion. "Yes, and what frightful claws," said Jack. "Wouldn't they make nice holes in your skin?" "Yes, my friends," observed I, "let us thank God that he has saved us from the danger. Thank him for the wisdom with which he has endowed men, so that they may be able to conquer such terrible beasts." Poor Flora," said Fritz, as he detached the dead body of our dear dog from that of the lioness. "She has done for us today what our old ass did in the case of the boa. Come, Ernest, see if you cannot induce your muse to fabricate an epitaph." "Ah, my muse, I must confess, has been too terribly frightened to make any rhymes." "Tush, go and meditate while we dig the grave of our poor hunter, and be sure to be ready when we are done." Flora received the honors of a funeral by torchlight. We dug a grave and silently placed in it the remains of the faithful animal, and a flat stone served to mark her resting place. Ernest composed the following legend, which he read to us, saying that he was too frightened for poetry, and Flora must be contented with prose. "Here lies Flora, a dog, remarkable for her courage and devotion. She died under the claws of a lion, on whom she also inflicted death." "Admirable," said Fritz. "It must be confessed, Ernest, you write full as good prose as poetry." At sunrise next morning we were up, and our first care was to deprive our noble prey of their superb furs. Jack wanted to make a mantle of the lion's skin, such as Hercules wore after his victory in the Nemean forest, but I adjourned all arrangements about their appropriation till a more convenient time. The heat of the sun had commenced to corrupt the oysters heaped upon the bank, and the effluvia which they exhaled induced us to return to Felsenheim, and early in the morning we set sail. Fritz set off before us as if to serve as pilot, but when he had conducted us through the vault and over the shoals, he rowed up to our canoe, and handing me a paper, shot off again like an arrow. I opened the paper quickly, and imagine my surprise when I found that instead of having forgotten the albatross and the smoking rock, he informed me in the letter that he was going in search of the unfortunate being. I had 1,000 objections to make to this romantic project, but Fritz rode so fast I could barely halloo through the speaking trumpet, "Return soon and be prudent," before he was out of sight. We gave to the cape where he left us the name of the Adieu Cape. We prayed that our adventurer might return safe, and I begged my rowers to redouble their endeavors so that we could arrive early at Felsenheim, for I suspected that my good Elizabeth would be worried at our long absence of 3 days. We finally arrived without accident, and the different treasures we had brought were joyfully received. The truffles, the lion skins, the pearls, the nankin became the objects of 1,000 questions, but they could not drive away the thoughts of Fritz. And my wife said she would willingly give up all our cargo of pearls, etc., if she could only see her beloved son. I had not yet spoken to my wife concerning the reason of Fritz's absence, as I did not wish to give rise to hopes which were so unlikely to be realized. But now I thought that it was my duty to do so. I therefore confided to her the secret of the albatross, and the dear woman, to my surprise, was calm and resigned. She only prayed with me that he might be successful. 5 days had thus passed away, and still Fritz had not returned, and his mother was so anxious and worried that I proposed to launch the pinnace and make a new excursion to the Bay of Pearls. We lost no time. The pinnace was prepared, and early the next day we bade adieu to Felsenheim, and soon were in sight of the promontory of the bay, when suddenly the vessel ran against a black mass and was nearly thrown over by the shock. My wife and sons uttered a cry of terror, but the boat soon righted, and I perceived that the obstacle was not a point of rock, as I had thought, but a marine monster of the family of blowers, for we soon saw him throw up into the air 2 spouts of water mingled with blood. I instantly pointed the cannons of the pinnace, and a discharge of artillery prevented the huge monster from overturning us, which he certainly would have done if the blow had not stunned him. We saw with pleasure that the waves carried the enormous body to the sandbank a little distance from the shore, and there it lay like a stranded ship. Suddenly, Ernest uttered a loud scream. "A man! A savage!" said he, and he pointed out to us in the distance a sort of canoe dancing over the waves. The person who conducted it seemed to have perceived us, for he advanced and then made toward a projecting point as if to communicate his discovery to his companions. I leave our sensations to the imagination of the reader. I had not the slightest doubt that we had fallen in with a band of savages, and we began to fortify our boat against their arrows by making a bulwark of the stalks of maize and corn we had brought with us. We loaded our cannons, guns, and pistols, and everything arranged, we stood ready behind our rampart, resolved to defend it as long as we were able. We dared not advance, for there was the savage, and Ernest, growing tired of the pantomime, observed that if we used the speaking trumpet, possibly our savage might understand some words of the half-dozen languages we were familiar with. The advice appeared good. I took up the speaking trumpet and bellowed out with all my force some words of Malay, but still the canoe remained immovable, as if its master had not comprehended us. "Instead of Malay," said Jack, "suppose we try English." So saying, he caught up the trumpet and in his clear, loud tone pronounced some common sailor phrases, well known to all who have ever been on board ship. The device succeeded, and we saw the savage advancing toward us, holding a green branch in his hand. Nearer and nearer he came, and at last we recognized in the painted savage our own dear Fritz. Chapter 58, Adventures of Fritz, Sir Edward Montrose, Our Adopted Sister, Attack of Wolves, Preparations for Return. When we had freed Fritz from our oft-repeated embraces, we commenced asking him all manner of questions, and speaking all together, the poor fellow was so confused he did not know what to do. I demanded an answer on 2 points only: whether his excursion had been satisfactory, and why he had played this farce of dressing himself like a savage and causing us such anxiety. "As to the purpose of my excursion," said he, with a joy he could scarcely conceal, "I have attained it." And the young man, as he said these words, pressed my hand, which he held in his. "As for my costume, I mistook you for a tribe of Malays or some other nation, and in the fear that you were enemies, I endeavored to disguise myself by painting the upper part of my body with powder soaked in water. The 2 reports of the cannon that I heard convinced me more and more that you were enemies. The Malay words that you addressed to me confirmed me, and I should still have been endeavoring to deceive you, and you would still have been in fear of me, if Jack had not bawled out those sailor phrases in his unmistakable voice." We all began to laugh over the farce we had been enacting, and Fritz, drawing me aside, said in an eager, joyous tone, "I have succeeded, Papa. The hand of God conducted me to the dwelling place of the poor shipwrecked girl, for it was a woman that had written those lines. 3 years she has lived on that smoking rock, all alone, destitute of everything. Can you believe it? But the poor girl has conjured me not to betray her sex, except to you and my mother. I have brought her with me. She is nearby on a little island just beyond the Bay of Pearls. Come and see her. Oh, do not say anything to my brothers. I want to enjoy their surprise when they find I have brought them back a sister, for I am sure she will allow them to call her so." I consented to the wish of my son, and without saying anything to the rest of the family, I ordered them to hoist the sails, weigh anchor, and make ready to depart. Fritz, who had changed his dress and washed off his disguise, flew about, hastening his less eager brothers. Then, jumping into his kajak, he piloted us through the shoals and reefs that were scattered along the coast. After an hour's sailing, he turned off and directed his course toward a shady island not far from the Bay of Pearls. We sailed close up to the shore and fastened the pinnace to the trunk of a fallen tree. Fritz, however, was quicker than we, and he was on shore and had entered a little wood in the middle of the island before we had yet landed. We followed him into the wood and soon found ourselves in the vicinity of a hut, built like those of the Hottentots, with a fire burning before it, on which some fish were cooking in a large shell. Fritz uttered a peculiar kind of halloo, and what was our surprise to see, descending from a large tree, a young and handsome sailor, who, turning his timid eyes on us, stood still as if he dared not approach. It was such a long time since we had seen a man, 10 years. Society had become so strange a thing to us that we remained stupefied. Our hearts felt for the young stranger, but our tongues remained dumb. The silence was broken by Fritz, who, taking the young sailor by the hand, advanced toward us. "My father, my mother, and you, my brothers," said he, in a voice broken by emotion, "behold a friend, a brother that I present you, a new companion in misfortune, Sir Edward Montrose, who, like ourselves, has been shipwrecked on the coast." "He is welcome among us," was the general cry. and approaching the young sailor, whom I easily recognized as being a woman, and taking her by the hand, I comforted and encouraged her, assuring the seeming man that among us he would always find food and sustenance. My wife and myself would be his parents, and my sons his brothers. My wife, moved by compassion, opened her arms, and the young sailor rushed into them, bursting into a flood of tears as he thanked us for our kindness. The most lively joy now reigned in our little circle, and his brothers poured question after question upon Fritz, who joyfully replied, "I will tell you all afterward. Let us attend now to our new brother." Supper was served, and my wife brought out a bottle of her spiced hydromel to add to the feast. Everybody spoke at once, and my sons addressed their new companion with such vivacity as to embarrass the timid stranger. My wife saw his distress, and as it was late, she gave the signal for retirement, taking the sailor with her on the pinnace, where she said she intended to provide a bed for him that would amply console him for the uncomfortable nights he had hitherto passed. We then separated, my wife and the stranger retiring to the boat, while my sons and I stopped to light and arrange our watchfires. The newcomer naturally became the subject of conversation, and Fritz recounted to his brothers the whole history of the albatross. He spoke of his thoughts and actions, but he became so excited in his narration that he forgot himself and the secret he had to keep. A word escaped him, and he called the young sailor Emily. "Emily, Emily," repeated his brothers, who had begun to doubt the mystery. "Emily, Fritz has deceived us, and Sir Edward is a girl. Our adopted brother turned into a sister." I leave to the imagination to picture the embarrassment of Fritz when he discovered his imprudence. In vain he endeavored to bring back his words. It would not do, and the girl could no longer hide her sex by the hat and pantaloons. The next morning it was a comic sight to see the embarrassment and awkwardness with which my sons approached one whom they had the day before embraced as a companion and a brother. My poor boys were not acquainted with the usages of polite society and the ease it inspires, and they appeared to a great disadvantage by the side of the beautiful English girl. The name of sister was substituted for that of brother, but pronounced with reserve and embarrassment. As for Emily, she was very much astonished at the discovery the young men had made, and she retreated as if for protection to the arms of my wife. But a moment after, recovering herself, she advanced and, extending her hands to each one of the boys, gracefully demanded for the sister the friendship they had extended to the brother. Gaiety was re-established, and we sat down to breakfast, which was composed of fruits, cold meat, and chocolate of our own making, which was a great treat to my new daughter, and recalled her native land to her mind. After breakfast, I proposed to weigh anchor and return to the Bay of Pearls, where the cachalot stranded on the shore offered us a magnificent prey. Arrived there, we debated in what manner we could carry away the oily substance with which the head and dorsal bone of this animal is filled. Unfortunately, we had no barrels in which we could gather the precious product. Emily rescued us from our dilemma by mentioning a process she had seen employed in India, which was to put the half-liquid substance in wet linen bags. The idea appeared excellent, and we immediately put it into practice. I gathered all the sacks I could find, and dipping them in the seawater, stretched them open with pieces of branches. We were 2 hours engaged in these preparations. The tide was not yet high enough to allow the pinnace to approach the bank where the whale lay, but we took the canoe and the kajak and set off, leaving the 2 women under the safeguard of Turk, and taking with us Phoebe, Braun, and the jackal. The monster lay extended like a huge wall. Our dogs ran up to it, and a moment after we heard some animals howling dreadfully. We hastened up and found our brave dogs valiantly contending with a troop of black wolves who were devouring the whale. 2 of their number were already stretched on the sand, 2 others were yet engaged with the dogs, and the rest fled at our approach toward a little wood. Our dogs acquitted themselves bravely. 4 wolves lay stretched upon the sand, but the noble animals had paid dearly for their victory. The blood streamed from all parts of their bodies, and the ears of Phoebe especially were dreadfully torn. Jack dressed their wounds with some hydromel, while Fritz and Francis aided me in another work. The former, after having armed his feet with cramp irons, climbed like a cat up the back of the monster, and cut open the enormous head of the cachalot with a hatchet, and then with a ladle dipped the spermaceti out of the head and emptied it into one of the sacks, which I held ready, while Francis covered the outside with wet sand and mortar, forming a solid crust through which none of the grease could escape. Our sacks were soon full, for as fast as Fritz emptied the head, the cavity was filled by a fresh supply from the backbone. The operation was very fatiguing, and I was glad when it was over. We then cut a quantity of willows and wove them into little pointed caps, which with which we covered the sacks in order to shield them from the sun and the birds of prey who were fast assembling in great numbers. We now thought of returning. The tide was high, but the load was too heavy for the boat. We therefore were obliged to leave it and return to the verdant little island which we had named Good Rencounter, because there we had first found Emily. The appearance of the sacks ranged on the sand was very droll. They exactly resembled little Chinese with their pointed hats, and we could not help laughing heartily at the sight. After having recounted our adventures and shown our 4 fine black wolves with their superb skins, we were invited by our dear housekeepers to sit down to an excellent dinner enriched by a new dish, a sauce after the manner of the Caribbees, made with eggs of land crabs with which the island abounded. I was undecided as to what means I should adopt to transport the spermaceti to the island, for the pinnace could not approach the bank near enough without risk of running aground, and our other boats were not large enough. Everyone gave his advice. When it came to Emily's turn, she observed in her soft, silvery tone, "If you are willing, my dear papa," for already she had accustomed herself to address me by that endearing name, "if you are willing, while you and my brothers are engaged in that disgusting tannery, I will promise to bring over your sacks." The next morning, before my sons were awake, Emily prepared for her expedition. She took a bladder of fresh water, a basket of provisions, and lightly descending the ladder of the pinnace, she seated herself in Fritz's kajak, untied it, and rode off with a grace and ease that surprised me. I would have called her back, but the little vixen gaily kissed her hand and soon was far on her way toward the bank of sand. She had chosen just the right time. The tide was rising and had just commenced to wet the bottom of the sacks. The adventurous girl jumped on shore, fastened all the sacks by cords to a rope which she had with her, and tied the rope to the kajak, and again embarking, drew after her all the sacks, the contents of which, being light, floated like bladders on the water. It was now full noon. We sat down to table, and after dinner began our preparations for setting out for Felsenheim, where we desired to install our new companion. We packed up everything we had, including Emily's treasures, both those she had saved from shipwreck and those she had made herself. Fritz had made her a box which held them all, and they really were very curious, consisting of clothes, ornaments, domestic utensils, and all sorts of articles which she had made in her exile out of the scanty material she had at her disposal. Emily now bade adieu to the island that had received her, and the trees that had sheltered her during her short sojourn. We could not leave the place without giving it a name, so we called the bay in which we anchored Happy Bay, in allusion to the joyful meeting we had had there. We now took the direction of the Bay of Pearls, where we were obliged to make a short stay before returning to Felsenheim, to which we were impatient to introduce our new companion. We'll stop there and start next time with Chapter 59. Thank you so much for listening. Bye-bye.